hope to help everyone have a better understanding of grief that can come from a late diagnosis or a self-diagnosis of autism and or ADHD, and also have a better understanding of how bereavement and grief in general can be experienced by neurodivergent adults. I do think it might be helpful to have a poll at this time. Is there, Esther, I believe, might be able to pull it up just to get a sense of where we're starting today. Okay, so 61, somewhat knowledgeable. Okay, sweet. So some of you who are very knowledgeable, some of this might be some review, but hopefully you get something out of today. I'm going to cover quite a wide spread of things. It's not a deep dive at all. I was telling Stephanie and Esther, I'm sure we could have a deep dive on each slide of the second half of this presentation at some point, but for another time. So more about me. So I like to just clarify and identify myself as someone who identifies as neurotypical, although I work with a lot of neurodivergent folks. Some of my clients like to call me neurobland because they identify as neurospicy. So I have a lot of neurodivergent family and friends, though I won't get into the specifics. I've experienced as a specialized tutor, an employment counselor working with adults with developmental disabilities, and then I started grief counseling after I did my master's, became interested in grief therapy in the middle of it, got interested in grief counseling in my master's degree. So here I am. This is my niche. I love talking about neurodivergence and grief and bereavement, so I'm happy to be here. In this presentation, I will be using neurodiversity or identity first language for neurodiversity affirming practice. So I will be saying sentences that include they are autistic, they are ADHD, or they're an ADHDer. This is the language most of my clients prefer. However, if you are working with neurodivergent individuals, best practice is to ask for what they prefer. Not everyone prefers this identity first language. It depends. So yes, ask whoever you are working with for their preference, as always. So I'm talking about autism and ADHD specifically today because that is my scope of practice. But neurodivergence includes all of these and more. This is not an exhaustive list. This comes from Sunny Jane Wise. I will include their information in the back of this presentation if you want to learn more. Many of these are also co-occurring. So some of my ADHD folks, for instance, might have also been diagnosed with OCD or have traits of OCD. So also fun fact, we weren't diagnosing individuals with autism and ADHD together or like having them co-occur until 2013. So before 2013, especially adults could not be diagnosed with both. So this is fairly new. So there's not a lot of research on people who are diagnosed with autism and ADHD. And also there's a bunch of barriers to being diagnosed with autism as an adult. So that's why I say self-identified if they're neurodivergent, because I recognize even if some people don't want to be diagnosed, but even if they do, not everyone does for lots of very valid reasons. I am including these in the presentation because I think they're helpful, but I'm not going to go through them for the sake of time. But I do think I want to highlight here that there are neurobiological differences between ADHD and autism, but there is also a lot of overlap in how they present. So it is also statistically more likely, the research is showing that someone is autistic and ADHD versus just autistic or just ADHD. So I do like to explore if someone comes to you saying, I'm ADHD, they might also be autistic. We don't know, unless they've actually gone through the whole process to get assessed. So this is also, I think, a really helpful diagram showing the overlap and the differences between ADHD and autism. Just so you have this here. Again, resources are included in the back of this presentation. Also, before we get deeper into this topic, I like to be on the same page of what I define grief and bereavement as. So grief being all the thoughts and feelings about a loss or change. It is normal, it is natural, it is healthy. And bereavement is just a very specific form of grief, specifically related to the death of a loved one or a death. And then mourning is the expression of grief. So it helps with integrating the loss and the grief into our stories and our identities and our lives. And the goal is that grief feels different over time if it is expressed and mourned. So that's my general philosophy around grief and mourning and bereavement. Getting into late and self-diagnosis grief here. Sometimes people wonder, how do we get here? How does someone end up with a later self-diagnosis? So we often get here after years of feeling different. So with that comes a lifetime of masking, which I will talk a lot more about later. Learning about themselves, either through therapy. Sometimes people will come to their therapist, or their therapist will say, I think you might be ADHD. Some people also do those online self-assessments. They are free, they are widely available online. And then some of my clients also come to me as parents of neurodivergent kids. Their kids get assessed and get diagnosed, and then they go, oh, wait, I'm the same. Hmm, maybe there's something here. And they start looking at their family tree and exploring that for themselves. And then some people also come to me saying, I've had friends that tell me I might be neurodivergent. They were just diagnosed with ADHD. They think I'm kind of similar to them. And then here we are. So lots of different paths that often tend to guide people into exploring this for themselves. And it's really, like, some people also don't love the labels. So I usually explain this is helpful if it validates and normalizes your experience, not helpful otherwise. So definitely had some people come to me and go, yeah, I think I'm autistic and ADHD. And then a few months later going, I'm not so sure anymore. That's normal. It's a journey. Um, so I'm not here to diagnose at all. Like, that's not my scope of practice. Uh, but we're here to explore, and even if someone isn't neurodivergent and we start working on how to be more neurodivergent affirming and how to, address things that aren't working in their life to better accommodate them, there's no harm in that. So with a late or a self-diagnosis, these are common experiences. Often there is relief. Oh, this is why I have felt different my whole life, or why I have been treated in such a way. So they can see themselves with a new lens. There's also grief. This is quite common though. Online, there's psychologists that talk about the grief and relief effect of a late diagnosis. So there are a lot of common questions that are asked with grief. Losses are recognized. There's loss of time, loss of opportunities, loss of supports, loss of understanding that they've experienced throughout the course of their life without maybe really drawing attention to it or acknowledging that that was missing. And maybe they have known that they've missed it. Now they're just really grieving it for the first time. And often comes change. So with change comes more change. Up to this point, things might not have been working that great for them because they just haven't known this about themselves. So relationships sometimes need to change. Coping strategies often have to change. Careers and lifestyles have to change sometimes too, with this new understanding and new perspective that they have of themselves and their life. So with all of this change comes grief from secondary losses as well. For example, people who realize they have less capacity than they thought they had may have to take stress leave, find a part-time job instead of working full-time. That's pretty common with some of my clients. So this can mean loss of employment, loss of finances, and that's just sometimes a lot more grief that comes with that. Also, loss of trust, especially loss of trust in parents and family that didn't say something. Folks often ask, why didn't I get diagnosed earlier? Especially when it's very, very clear. There were signs. There are a couple common reasons why. This might not be the full every reason why, but often neurodivergent traits have been normalized in families. And the ones that maybe the parents or the grandparents where it was normalized, they didn't receive support or accommodations. So then they don't look into those supports and accommodations for their children. The stigma around diagnosing and around in neurodivergence and disability is also massive. So I do talk about this directly with my clients just to acknowledge and validate that this is reality. We live in a world that does not like to talk about disability, doesn't like to acknowledge it or accommodate it. And yeah, that could be a whole tangent. This is why I have my notes here. Parents were often blamed for kids being different or, something quote unquote being wrong with them. So that's another reason why I see parents not diagnosing their kids or looking into assessments. And then parents may have also believed that a diagnosis wouldn't help their kid or it might make things worse. Personal example here. So I have one of my many family and friends that is diagnosed, is one of my sisters. She is diagnosed with autism, and she was diagnosed when she was very, very young. And it was a very conscious decision my parents made to have her be included in the public school system with me and my siblings, because back then that wasn't such a given. Now it's the norm, but it wasn't back when I was young. So that has stuck with me of just how separated folks with disabilities and diagnoses and neurodivergence were and still are to a large extent. It's in different ways, more or less. So another secondary loss, going back here, another secondary loss is a loss of expectations. So these quotes I have here on the slide come from Orly Long. She's an RCC who's ADHD as well. So grief is normal after realizing that the expectations that others have had of them have not been realistic and haven't been fair. Their needs have not been met, and that's been exhausting. So that's a really big grief point for neurodivergent individuals. So I would also say that for some, it has been traumatic for them. So when you don't know you're neurodivergent, you are being told and you understand yourself that you're neurotypical, because that's in our society, that's the default. So this misunderstanding often leads to experiencing microaggressions.
Sorry, Jess, you just got muted there.
Am I back? Okay, thanks. Sorry, this misunderstanding often leads to microaggressions, such as, you are too sensitive. Why can't you just do this? Or you're being too loud. You're lazy. You have so much potential. I hear these all the time from my clients. So yes, again, that could be a whole rant. So these messages get internalized, and then we get internalized ableism. Neurodivergent people often mask as a result, which takes more energy. So when I work with people through this, we have to talk about unmasking, but considering safety, safety, safety. Safety is always top concern here. So safety needs to always be considered, because masking is a response to living in a harmful world that doesn't accept or understand them, and is not accepting or understanding the differences or their needs. So I mention this because when there's trauma, there's always grief. There's always a loss of something. Again, loss of trust, loss of respect, loss of safety and security. So the grief just typically goes unrecognized and then unprocessed. That's why I bring attention to it. We talk about trauma quite a lot, I think, or a lot more than we used to. We talk about trauma-informed practice, which is great. This is, I would say, some of the complex trauma that neurodivergent people experience, and then with that comes grief. So wanted to include that piece. One more thing I'll mention about grief from a late or self-diagnosis is that there's usually a longing for a different past, better relationships, more understanding, and accessible supports. Longing is really the thing that differentiates grief from depression, from what I've seen and from what I've learned from all my trainings and stuff. So these are just some examples of the longing that I see that comes with grief from a late or self-diagnosis. So moving on to neurodivergence and grief and bereavement in general here. These are the topics that I'm going to cover as much as I can with the rest of our time together. I am pulling from my experience, from my training, from online resources, and from research. Sources, again, will be included at the end for anyone who wants to dive deeper into these. So first is masking. Masking can be used intentionally to keep someone safe. For example, if they know I'm going to a grocery store, I gotta perform a certain way to get through and to not experience trauma, microaggressions, being treated differently, etc. Or it can be used automatically without conscious awareness, even when they're in a safe environment. There's several clients that just mask by default, even with their partners who are super supportive, or even with their family or parents who love them no matter what. It becomes an automatic just default, which often leads to burnout, which is the next slide. But in grief and bereavement, this can show up as anxiety about being appropriate, quote unquote, appropriate. I'll hear clients ask, what should I be feeling? What's expected of me here? Like they're just to themselves are asking this, what should I do? And I see this a lot, specifically with anger. Anger is sometimes confused with aggression, especially if they've experienced a lot of aggression from other people, and therefore they don't want anything to do with anger. They don't want to feel it at all, even though it's a very super valid emotion, very common with grief. So if the goal is to express our emotions, but safely, then there needs to be a conversation about safely expressing anger, which can be uncomfortable for some people. There can also be anxiety around funerals, how to perform at a funeral I've experienced, especially when there's a lot of people that they don't know who are going to be there. Burnout here. So my clients typically come to me already in burnout. I usually get the folks that are masking by default or all the time. So this eventually leads to burnout. So when their capacity does not match expectations or available support, this is often the case. I usually describe burnout with spoon theory. This might be familiar with some people. I believe this is related to also chronic pain, chronic illness, but this is common language with the folks I work with. Spoons being basically energy units for those who haven't heard of this before. We only get so much energy per day, only get so many spoons per day. So when my clients go, okay, well, if I've only had this many spoons, how have I burnt out? How have I used more spoons than I have? The way I've described it is like they're borrowing from the next day spoons and the next day spoons, and now there's no spoons that they can reach for once they're burnt out, and they're just grasping for forks. And then so it's about really doing less that feels like work, using less spoons and using the spoons that they have per day and trying to recover. So it's a whole, which is just the language that we use to describe what's going on. So naturally, grief and bereavement take away more spoons. They are exhausting. It's exhausting because grief affects us in every way, as I think most of us know, emotionally, mentally, socially, physically, spiritually, or more. So overwhelm is a super common experience as well, even without being neurodivergent. I think grief and bereavement overwhelms folks, in general. So to work through this with clients, again, we focus on doing less that feels like work. So maybe not less overall. Maybe we need to do more activities or more stress reducing, relaxing things, but that would be less work. So examples, reducing expectations of themselves, not going to every social gathering, spending time doing restful activities and asking friends to help or body double would be examples of that. What can make burnout recovery and prevention, as well as grief and bereavement, a bit more challenging is alexithymia. So alexithymia is basically when someone has difficulty identifying and describing their emotions and their internal sensations. In grief and bereavement, this can look like someone having a really hard time figuring out for themselves how much they've been affected by a loss. Or also if someone is struggling to recognize when they're upset or when they're in need of supports, then asking for that support in grief will be more difficult. So in these cases, it usually helps to work on mindfulness skills. An emotion wheel can be really helpful. There's also out there, I can't remember her name, but she has an emotion sensation wheel. So helping these individuals take notice of what their body is doing first, and then associating that with what emotions are they feeling, instead of identifying emotions first and then noticing how that's coming out in behavior. So working a little bit from the opposite end of that. And just because someone may be alexithymic doesn't mean that they don't experience emotions intensely. For a lot of neurodivergent folks, emotions are felt more intensely and for a long time. But then for others, they experience emotions not as intensely and for not as long as some may expect. So this might, be common and understanding, general understanding that everyone has here. But again, everyone's different. So everyone's experience of grief and bereavement is different. Fun fact, autistic people process more information though at rest due to synaptic differences they have. So there's been research on that. There's a study. I just use that to validate my clients that the ones that are saying, I am not over it, I feel like I should be over it, or this is taking me a long time. That's from a neurodivergent lens, that's pretty typical, pretty common. So I'm encouraging my clients to be more patient with themselves, more self-compassionate. Those would be great tools to have in those situations, but also using that research to go, when you are at resting point, you are automatically processing about 42% more information than the average person. That processing takes time. So that's when you're at rest. So not when you're heightened, not when you're grieving, not when you're, when you're anxious, like that might increase by so much more. So that I like, so that's there's a yes. So I like to say that to validate them. With ADHDers, using their out of sight, out of mind ability can be helpful for emotion regulation, to distract themselves or compartmentalize their grief. But yes, and then I usually say, so I bring in the dual process model for that too. The dual process model is basically saying there's two processes happening at the same time. We have to process our grief and tend to our grief, and we have to also process our day-to-day life and our life tasks. The goal is not to stay in our life tasks and avoid our grief, and the goal is not to be in our grief all the time and avoid life tasks. We have to find a way to oscillate between the two. So using that skill they have, the out of sight, out of mind, can actually be helpful for that. They can compartmentalize their grief and go, I need to get my work done. But then they can also need to learn to come back and actually tend to their grief when it's knocking at their door and the grief waves come flooding in. So ADHDers, however, have a more difficult time processing their grief sometimes, since they have a more difficult time processing abstract concepts. So it is typical for ADHDers to struggle with managing their finances, managing their time. This is because they are abstract. They are not tangible concepts. What is money? What is time? When I ask my ADHD clients that, they're like, yes, what is time? What is money? I don't know. So emotions are also quite abstract, especially if they have not noticed how emotions can show up in their bodies. So again, helping them with that, tangible grief tools can be quite helpful for ADHDers to process grief because it just makes it more real, more in front of them. So again, could probably say a lot more about emotion regulation on this topic, but I'm including this as well. This is my favorite diagram of the window of tolerance. I reframe this as the window of capacity for some of my folks I work with because they tolerate a lot more than they have capacity for. So when they are out of their capacity, that's when dysregulation shows up. And this is one of the only ones I've seen where dysregulation is actually shown. Usually it's just window of tolerance and then hyperarousal, hypoarousal. There's sometimes I think there's a middle. I think there's a gap between the two before we jump into fight or flight, freeze or fawn. So again, some tangible visuals, pictures sometimes are helpful. And then I also like to highlight this regulation means that our reaction does not match what's happening. So if someone died and they are extremely upset and distressed and sad, that makes sense. That doesn't necessarily mean they're dysregulated. That is an appropriate, a typical reaction to what they're experiencing. And so again, normalizing and validating their experiences with that can be really helpful. Then we have rejection sensitivity dysphoria. So, rejection sensitivity, rejection sensitive dysphoria, two technically different things. The dysphoria is basically saying the rejection's not there, but it's being perceived as there. So as we all know, as human beings, rejection is painful, and even more so for neurodivergent folks. So I see a lot of neurodivergent clients who don't know, or sorry, who don't want to feel their grief because it is more intense and more painful, not just emotionally, but physically. And RSD really highlights that. So in bereavement, not only have they lost a loved one, but often they have lost support from family and friends who can't or don't know how to support them in their grief and bereavement. So this is just pain on top of pain. So reaching out for support is scary for a lot of them too, because the risk of rejection, even from people who have always been there for them or who they know they'll be there for them, is just so high. And so they don't reach out. Um, it's important too to help identify safe people with capacity with with individuals you're working with too. And then use I like the DLR model. So who are your doers? Who are your listeners? And who are your respite people? Categorizing the people in their social network into these categories. Maybe some of them will cover more than one category, but this often helps simplify things of like if I'm reaching out to, like say if my client goes, okay, I've been reaching out to my mom for emotional support, but she's terrible at listening to me. Like maybe she's just really good at doing the practical stuff. So we just have a conversation about that. If we're asking her to help with delivering groceries or cleaning my house or whatever, instead of the emotional support listening, so like that type of support, then we're going to feel less rejected because we're asking her for skills and support that she has the capacity to provide instead of not. So I like that model too, to help it break it down for folks. So another thing I see is persistent desire or pervasive drive for autonomy. PDA, like if you look up PDA, it technically stands for pathological demand avoidance. That is not the neurodivergent affirming term. That is not pathological, so we don't use that term. So we've reframed it. Everyone in the neurodivergent affirming community has reframed it as persistent desire or pervasive drive for autonomy or extreme demand avoidance as well. Again, ask who you're working with what they prefer to call it. Some people prefer different terms. But PDA is in short a need for autonomy. It is more commonly associated with autism, but I do see it in folks who are in burnout in general because the demands haven't matched their capacity for so long. So in grief and bereavement, there are so many more demands. The demand to grieve and mourn specifically, but also other ones, especially in bereavement, someone was taken from them, which was out of their control. So this might really trigger PDA. They did not choose this. And it is so important that PDA folks have the ability to choose for themselves how to grieve and how to mourn. The grief tools I offer are always presented as very optional for this reason, but for everyone, obviously. They can use them or not. It is up to them. They need to feel as much control over how they're processing as possible because of this, and validated in how they're processing and grieving and mourning. Um, yeah. So this was a very overview of these are areas I see and come up a lot. But here are a few more pieces I want to include today. So I've noticed that with some of my clients, there is a more instrumental approach versus a more intuitive approach to grief, which may appear more logical to some. Like they might go, okay, if someone died, there are things to do after the death, and then that's all there is to it. Um, and then for others, there's a greater interest in death or how the person died. A new hyper focus may develop. So for example, to mourn, an ADHDer might learn a lot about cancer or a lot about COVID. And if that's the way their loved one died. And then learning and gathering information can be really helpful to cope with anxiety, especially when neurodivergent folks struggle with changes and transitions, which is really, really common. So especially those outside of their control again, like when a loved one dies. So having more understanding around that, I think, is critical. Neurodivergent folks are also more at risk for disenfranchised grief, which is when a loss or how someone grieves a loss is invalidated or unacknowledged by society. So the double empathy problem acknowledges communication challenges between neurotypes, not just between neurotypicals and neurodivergent people, but even between someone who's autistic and someone who's ADHD. So if a neurodivergent person is surrounded by neurotypical people who don't understand them, there are likely to be challenges with communication. That's what the double empathy problem is saying, basically. And that's also used to validate if someone neurodivergent comes to me and goes, no one gets it. That there might be that at play. And this is made worse by the fact that we as a society typically don't acknowledge and don't like talking about and dismiss issues around death and disability. So double taboo there. So to wrap things up, the ultimate goal with grief and bereavement is integration. If we work with neurodivergent people, we do need to be asking, how do we support them in their grief and bereavement? What do they need? What do they need from us? Grief and bereavement typically make eating, sleeping, and exercising challenging, and these are already challenging things usually when you're neurodivergent. So focusing on supporting someone with physical self-care may be critical and a first step, depending on where they're at. We can encourage neurodivergent individuals to explore their special interests or new areas of interest when they're in grief and bereavement. We can also encourage them to learn more about themselves, their traits, what they need in grief. That's really hard usually for them to identify, especially if they don't have a good sense of their identity from years of masking. And then having realistic goals and expectations is incredibly important as well. Some people may take months or years longer to process a loss than one might expect. Some people might need different boundaries with work or with the people in their lives. And in the research, it was the most evident thing that was popping out to me was that neurodivergent people really truly do not feel supported to talk about their grief in general, let alone process their grief in any other way. So validate different ways of grieving, be emotional support people. That's truly the underlining message that I have today. I have noting the time. I'm going to end it there. That is really um, what I want to emphasize there. These are some of the resources I pulled from. Again, there's so many more. These are the ones I included today, and that's all. We'll wrap it up there.
Thanks so much, Jess. That went by so fast.
Yeah, I
I
did.
do want to open it up if anyone has questions, just reflections. Feel free. You can pop it in the chat or just you can raise your hand, unmute. Yes, I see Arisha. Go ahead.
Are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so people with like near people who are like neurodivergent, do they tend to go do they so like do they tend to go through their grief like a little bit later, like a normal person would go through their grief like right away, but then people who have neurodivergence, they tend to go through it like afterwards? Is that how it works?
It depends. But I would say a lot of times, yes, either because they don't feel permission to grieve right away, or they haven't acknowledged that they're grieving for different reasons, or they haven't received
So
like permission from themselves or others
yeah,
that
yeah.
that's okay. So yeah, there's lots of reasons, and then that might lead to delayed grief. Um,
So like
yeah.
I work at hospice, right? Let's just say
Mhm.
I have a family member who has neurodivergence and their loved one is passing away. They might not be able to recognize their grief right away,
Mhm.
and like it might take them some time to be able to do so. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I was just a bit confused about that part, so I'm just
Yeah.
clarifying.
No worries. Yeah. That's I
That's
would
how I would go. And so like how do you help them like if that's the case? Like do you just accept it or do you try to help them recognize it?
it's a good question.
Because like I work at hospice, so I deal with like grief like all the time with
Yeah.
like patients and families that I work with. This was like kind of like one of the reasons why I took the training because I was like, okay, let's just say if I do end up seeing a person with like neurodivergence, then do I just let it be or help them accept it? Because sometimes it might not be good for them to accept their grief like 6, 7 months later because it might like hit them harder, which can be unhealthy at times,
Yeah.
right?
I mean,
Sorry, I can't hear
I'm
you.
trying to, sorry. I'm thinking. Um, I would say like I normalize pretty much every neurodivergent person's experience because
Okay.
it's, and it's not necessarily unhealthy for them, I would say, if they have to process it later. I even have folks that like they know they have something to grieve. Like I've worked with someone with who had a miscarriage and they have a box of belongings from that time. And we've worked
Yeah.
for months together and they know that they need to open that box and touch those linking objects and process that. And but they're not, right? So
Oh.
there's not, I can invite them to do that together. We can work on what make it what might make it easier for them to do that, but ultimately it's up to them and it's their own timeline. So
So do I
if
just like respect their space and basically let it be? Like, do
yeah,
let them know, hey, you have my support, and if you need to talk, I'm here for you, type of thing, but
absolutely, like
not
giving them
force it
resources
out.
that they can go to when they're ready,
Yeah.
that would be a yeah, really practical thing to do.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see Mel's hands up. Go ahead.
Hey Jess,
Hello.
thanks for the awesome talk.
Yeah.
What this has me thinking about are anniversaries.
Hmm.
And so I have a couple clients, some who are pretty, it's been a pretty recent loss. And then I have some other clients where it's been many years. And it seems like there's a question for these folks about what to do, as if there is like an expectation of something you should do. So I'm wondering when it comes to clients like this, do you have any tips or suggestions if someone is trying to ask you like how to go about that process?
Yes. Again, always up to them. And that is when I clarified the only thing to do with grief is to mourn. So as
Mm,
long as they're finding ways of mourning, wonderful. That's all you can do, right? Like you can express it when it comes up. Like feel the things, do the rituals, touch those linking objects, spend time
mhm,
with them, talk to them. Like any way they can connect with their loved one, everything is like right answer. That's all like that's what we do. It doesn't have to be all the time, but
mhm,
when we normalize that and like validate like that's what we do with grief, then they're like, and they usually can think of lots of ways they're already doing that, right?
mhm,
So if they want more ways, you can help them brainstorm what other ways can we do to express and to mourn our grief and to remember that person or to bring them more into your life, if they feel they want to be more connected to them.
mhm.
But typically they're already doing some of those things, you know?
Yeah. Because I'm thinking on the flip side, I know what you were saying earlier of some people can take time to even explore those feelings. So I think it's also leaving space that if that day comes, they don't feel anything, not to have to
Yeah.
force
And that's
that
okay,
either.
right? They don't have to cry every time. Like that's
Mhm,
okay. Yeah. Like, yeah, very much validating. Like whatever they're feeling, whatever they're going through, wherever they're at on their journey is okay. It is. That's normal, typical, acceptable. It's
mhm,
fine, right?
mhm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brittany. I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I'm just wondering, in regards to like that hyper focus or hyper fixation,
Hmm.
along with that kind of that perceived unfairness, which I know is normal for grief in general, like that it's unfair that this person died. But what have you noticed with individuals with like ADHD with that hyper fixation and that it's not fair? What have been ways that you found helpful for them to navigate that?
Beyond just validating how unfair it actually is and providing space for them to really feel that.
Yeah, like
Um,
beyond that, 'cause like the hyperfixation I know, and even as an ADD individual myself, is like sometimes part of that process where you need to revisit and rehash it, but there's like that downsloping spot. So, like I have my own experiences with that, but I just wonder like what have you seen as beneficial when there's just that it's too has too much of a bite in a way.
mm, it obviously depends on who you're working with. Some of this might not hit with them, but I think diving even deeper into what other emotions are around that feeling, because that might be masking a feeling that's actually underneath that's more uncomfortable for them. Um, but exploring also just the depth of the grief and even, yeah, I think I would have more questions around like, what else is there? Yes, it's unfair. And is there more? Is there also underlying guilt? because that's usually pretty common. Anger. Do they have enough ways of expressing like those other emotions as well? And with a sense of injustice and the focus on this wasn't fair, is there anything that they can do that's in their control where they can help with like creating a sense of justice more? Sometimes that's where the finding meaning comes into play. Like what is their identity and purpose wrapped up into that at all? Like, does that make sense?
No, it does. Thank you.
There's other questions, feel free to throw it in the chat. Just, I had a question,
Yeah.
and maybe others have this as well. I'm wondering if you have any tools that you might use with someone if they have a loved one who has a serious illness, who may be dying within the next few months or weeks, like with that anticipatory kind of grief process. Is there anything that you might use specifically with neurodivergent folks?
So one of the tools, again, it's not for everyone at all, but one of the tools that, especially for folks that need it more tangible, we do grief timelines or loss timelines. So with a person they're about to lose, I'll encourage them to make a list of things that have impacted. Well, we usually start with like the course of their life. So losses that they've experienced over the course of their life to process that before we dive into relationships. But that relationship timeline is what are all the positive and negative, the good and the bad things that have impacted their relationship. And then from there, is there anything that has yet to be said or that needs to be said again, especially if they're anticipating that loss, so that they can communicate with that person, if that's the goal, to connect with them before that person dies. Things that they want to forgive them for, or things that they want. And this is not to be communicated with them, like all of them. Like, I don't recommend going to that person and being like, I think you should apologize for this. Like, no, no, no. But things that they wish that they would like to apologize for, maybe, or things that they would like to communicate, like, I have compassion, thankfulness, just anything to really for themselves to process all those thoughts and feelings around the upcoming loss in that relationship. But yeah, does that make sense? So there's like more tangible tools, like with writing like those lists, those timelines, just to actually make it so they can see it, what's impacted that relationship, why is this so meaningful for them? And then how do they want to use that going forward as they're anticipating this loss? But I use those tools as well once someone has already died too. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. I am just going to go to the chat. Amber, thank you so much just for sharing from your personal experience. And Amber also shared a book here, which is wonderful. So we'll make sure we add that to our resource list. Thank you so much. And Melanie, just your experience as well. Yeah, we're going through that with one of our pets, anticipating of when we're going to have to put him down as he's sick and the hyperfixation of it. Yeah, that's so hard, Melanie. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Again, that's basic self-care. That's like, everyone knows this, but it's so foundational, like helping someone, like as you're anticipating loss. How are we eating? How are we sleeping? How are we exercising? And if we can't eat as much, or if we can't exercise or sleep as much, or if we're oversleeping or whatever it is, self-compassion in that is so, so crucial. Like, it is normal for grief to impact you in these ways. And then can we take care of ourselves in that way and normalize that and understand what's going on for ourselves and just be there in the discomfort, like just holding the discomfort with people. That applies to the sense of justice as well. Like, this isn't fair. Can we hold space for how uncomfortable that is? And how do we do that? And that's going to look different for everyone, right? Distress tolerance skills, pretty foundational too. Yeah.
I did have another question. I know we only have a few minutes left. If anyone has another question, feel free to jump in. I'm wondering if, and I know there's different opinions and ideas about like complicated grief. Do you find that, is there challenges with some people feeling that maybe neurodivergent folks, like when does it maybe go into where you need a little bit more support and it kind of goes in that complicated grief zone? or do with kind of normalizing the experiences, do we kind of just not kind of go in that area? Does that question make any sense what I'm asking?
I think so. Um, hmm, I don't know, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair.
I don't know.
I'm just going to
I
go back
think
to the
by the time
chat
I
here.
see clients, it might be complicated already,
Mm,
and naming it helps too. Naming that as like this is complicated. Also knowing, like for me, I work with a colleague who specializes in EMDR, and so sometimes if I can notice that okay, the trauma around this loss is impacting them more, and they actually we're not able to really grieve because there are so many the trauma symptoms are so severe. Sometimes trauma work is actually more useful first and then once we go work through some of the trauma, then we can attend to the grief. And so I work really closely with my trauma colleague.
mm.
We go back and forth of is it a lot, do we need to attend to the grief or the trauma? I mean, both are simultaneous, but sometimes doing trauma work is actually more beneficial depending on how complicated um, the loss was as well.
Yeah, that's super helpful. I think that's where kind of my question was going. So thank you for
Okay,
pulling
good.
that out.
Sweet.
Yeah,
I was like,
yeah.
let me think about that for a second.
Mhm. Yeah, just okay, yeah, and Jan had a question here. Please describe the trauma symptoms.
The trauma symptoms that I might notice that might make me think this is we need to focus on trauma maybe before grief.
Yeah, I
Um,
think so. Yeah, yeah.
I think a really common one um, is flashbacks. So, which is classic PTSD. Um, and if I notice that that person is feeling stuck for a really long time, like with grief, it comes and goes. And if someone's experiencing PTSD and not getting the appropriate trauma, so I'm just recognizing my scope of practice is in grief and neurodivergence, and I'm trauma informed, but I don't practice EMDR or things that will really target trauma specific symptoms in that way. So that's when I'm very careful to refer out and like this is beyond my scope of practice here. So if someone's feeling, let's say, really stuck, I know they have friends and family reaching out to them. I know that they are, you know, they're not, they're really struggling with taking care of themselves. And the messages that are around, like what they're telling themselves, is specifically related to the trauma of the situation. Then I might go, okay, the grief isn't moving, and we're not over maybe months. I'm not noticing this person taking the steps to mourn or to express or to be with the people that I know are there to support them. So if I just get a sense of stuck, that usually tells me there's some major trauma going on. Does that make sense?
All right, I'm just going to go back. I think I missed a question here from Joni. So many of these feelings experienced are normal. I'm assuming one can have masking without neurodivergent diagnosis. Can you explain the difference between masking and neurotypical versus masking with neurodivergent folks?
Yes. So I sure can because I'm neurotypical. I recognize I mask. I like not mask in the same sense. The difference to me is the level of exhaustion that comes with masking. So I might go into different social situations and change a little bit of how I'm presenting myself depending on who I'm with or what I'm expecting. Someone who's neurodivergent, when they mask, it depletes them. It is taking away precious resources, precious energy. They have to recover after. They need time and space to process and to come back to a sense of, okay, I can go again. So it's just the amount of energy it takes and how exhausting it is. I get people who are exhausted. They're at the end of the rope, typically, or very close to it. Um, yeah, that's the biggest difference for what I would say.
Thank you. I see carrier question here. Can you speak to acquired neurodivergence that can come on when
Mhm.
an NT is in bereavement in particular?
Yeah. So the one that comes to mind is when someone gets a traumatic brain injury. So like ADHD and autism, They are neurodevelopmental. They are lifelong. You have them like that's how your brain has a traumatic brain injury, and their brain functions differently afterwards. It might present very similarly to ADHD, for example, but it's not ADHD, it's a traumatic brain injury. So that would be acquired. And then with neurodivergence, again, neurodivergence is just basically saying your nervous system diverges from what's society expects, basically. And that's where it's really sometimes really best to highlight to folks too. This is different depending on what cultural background you come from or where you are in the world, right? How we see neurodivergence might be very different than other places in the world. This is just how our Western society is talking about this right now. So, and it's going to change. So, acquired or not, everyone has different needs, bottom line. So, really supporting people's needs and helping them identify their needs is really, I think, crucial, like important, no matter if it was acquired or not. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I think we have time if there's maybe one or two more questions. If anyone has one. Yeah, question here. Please let me know how I can best support clients during their period of burnout.
Mm-hmm. That bottom line is helping them do less, do less, do less, do less. Whether it's reducing, sometimes it's just reduced, like this might be and I really do have clients that are like helping them do less is me not having the expectation that they should maintain eye contact the entire hour we have a counseling session. I have clients that will just stare at the corner of my office the whole time or turn their back to me so that they can say something difficult because that helps them not have to worry about even engaging with someone as they're talking about a really difficult thing. So helping them do less of what exhausts them, right? So do less masking. So creating and sometimes you might need to actually tell them like, this is like, I tell them like, this is my goal. My goal is to create a safe space so that you don't so that you feel as much as possible that you don't have to mask here, that you can do what you need to do to support yourself, that you can stim, that you can use your fidgets, that you can not look at me, that you can move as much as you want, all these different things. But then when it comes to life stuff, do they need to take a break from anything? Do they need to have like make sure there's an hour when they come home from work that they have no demands on them whatsoever? Is that possible? Not always when they're parents. So it looks different when you're talking to parents. They're like, how do I do less? I am responsible for my children 24/7. That will just be a different conversation. What does looking less mean for them? What would it look like? What would they like to happen? And they might not know. That's okay. That might just take time to reflect and to think about what would it look like if you had less demands, less on your plate, less stress, less, and then more of what recharges you. But that will usually come after the doing less part. The person I like really learned this from is Dr. Jennifer Kemp there. She's an ADHD psychologist in Australia. When she experienced burnout, she had 50 clients on her caseload, and she had to reduce it to 12, which was incredibly difficult as someone who loves to help people as a psychologist, especially with what she's doing. But that was necessary for her to recover from burnout and then prevent burnout. So, yeah, doing less.
Great, thank you so much, Jess. Oh, just a comment here from Amber. Video therapy sessions are a good idea as well. If you're licensed to do it, keeps the client in a familiar environment where masking is less likely. Yeah, I love these kind of practical thoughts and what you're saying just about just kind of giving people the permission or reminding them they have the permission to feel safe. So like turning away, like turning around, I love that. I think that's so good to kind of break down those expectations for people so they can feel as safe as possible. So thank you again. Thank you all who were able to join us today. So as a reminder, within about a week, we'll send out a recording of the session. We'll have the resource links and a summary as well. And we'll also include a PDF copy of Jess's slides that you can feel free to share with your colleagues. And we'll also include a registration link for our next session, which is on difficult conversations and decisions in dementia care. So that's going to be June 24th. So again, just thank you so much for being here. If you have time, when you click the the leave button for Zoom, you'll have an opportunity to do a survey. We appreciate any feedback you have. And Jess, I hope that this can just be the start of a conversation on this topic. And we had lots of people interested. So thank you again, everyone, and take care.